Hi folks, this is All the Fruit, and today I want to tell you about the mysterious, enigmatic, banned, prosecuted, even considered harmful and madness-inducing Amerikanerreben, or grapevines of the Americans. Well, what is so special about those grapevines? Well, a bit of history. Like for hundreds of years, Europeans had ruled the world, and European wine has ruled the wine world. Why is this? Well, the traditional wine growing areas in West Asia and North Africa had been taken over by the Muslims in the Middle Ages. Muslims are not so fond of alcohol. Europeans, on the other hand, were incredibly fond of wine. You cannot imagine how important it was. Taxes were being paid in wine. It was one of the main substitutes of money. It was one of the main commodities traded locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, worldwide. People, especially in Southern Europe, would drink it for every meal. They would drink it instead of meals most of the time. And even the northern countries like Britain, in the times of Shakespeare, the Canary sack was the standard wine drunk in Britain. It came from the Canary Islands. Shakespeare was actually paid only in wine and nothing else. Later, port replaced the Canary sack. And yeah, wine was exported into the European colonies. It was being drunk on the ships. And on the ships and in the colonies, the nobles, the officers were drinking wine, while the riffraff, the sailors, the hillbillies, the peasants would drink stuff like rum and toddy and other things unpleasant to the educated palate. Yeah, the world was in order for the Europeans and European wine. And, well, those Europeans thought we have now those colonies, for example, in America, the area that later would become the United States. Why not grow wine there? The climate seems to be similar enough to the European climate, and we have grapevines for so many different climates. So they introduced European grapes to America, but those wines would wither and die. Nobody knew exactly why, but yeah, they said, okay, well, doesn't seem to work, but they kept trying. However, all the European traditional grape varieties basically are descendants of one European species, Vitis vinifera, the wine-bearing vine. Well, however, there are dozens of other Vitis species worldwide. There are dozens of them in East Asia and also dozens of them in North America. So the settlers thought, well, if our European wine doesn't grow here, why not use the American stuff? After all, basically the first thing Europe learned about America was that there are grapevines and grapes there. The Vikings, who landed in Newfoundland over 1,000 years ago, named America Vinland or Wineland. So the first European name for America was the land of wine. They probably found this stuff here, Vitis labrusca, growing on a coastal slope in Newfoundland. Well, the berries were good enough to eat. Even today, those are the main wine, well, the main grapes which are used in the US for juice and jelly and stuff like that. So the European settlers thought, why not make wine out of them? However, the wine tasted disgusting to the European palate. So they invented the derogatory term of foxy for those American wines. And so, yeah, the world was still pretty much in order, at least for rich people. They were usually coming from the superior European culture. They could buy superior European commodities. They could import superior European wines, while the peasants and hillbillies in the Appalachian Mountains and elsewhere, they would have to built their own stuff. They would have to live their hillbilly life, and they would have to drink their hillbilly foxy wines. So everything was okay for the European colonialists and later for the upper class of landowners in the United States. And then somebody thought, maybe as a meme, well, let's import some of those grapevines to Europe. People have been trying to hybridize European and American grapevines with some success in the US, but there was no really good reason to import any of those to Europe. I guess it was maybe to have a good laugh about the inferior American grapevines. Well, the Europeans soon were laughing at the other side of their face, or how is the expression in English, because those grapevines of the Americans brought with them phylloxera, a little insect sucking at their roots, and mildew, a fungus growing on their leaves and berries. Well, those American grapevines, they had evolved with this stuff and they could cope with it, but the European wine growing areas were devastated within a few years. For example, here, this area around Heidelberg, which used to be a wine growing area since the Middle Ages, taxes here were paid in wine. Those terraces here were built to house vineyards. And then in the 19th century, not only in the area of Heidelberg but throughout Europe, the wine industry was destroyed within few years. Many areas like this here switched from wine to fruit trees, and since then cherries, plums and apples have been the backbone of agriculture around here. But you cannot imagine what damage this was to Europe. Millions of people lost their income. Taxes couldn't be paid anymore. Hundreds of millions of people had nothing left to drink. A lot of areas would switch to apple cider. A lot of areas would switch to brandy. A lot of areas would still maintain some small-scale wine production, but usually just for home use. Ancient varieties would be preserved in single grapes here and there, but the gigantic vineyards of Europe that had provided a drink that was more common than water were gone. Well, the solution came basically also with the American grapevines. You could take the American grapevines and graft European grape varieties on them, and there at least you could save them from the phylloxera, which was at the roots, and the American grapevines could cope with it. Then pesticides and stuff like that were invented, and the European wine growing was starting to recover. Well, forward almost 100 years, the guy with the mustache comes to power, and one of the first things the Nazis do when they seize power in Germany is to ban the Amerikanerreben. I cannot really explain to you how this sounds for a German. It's not the American grapes, it's not the grapes of America, it's the grapes of the Americans, the grapes of the enemy. Well, Hitler banned them because they were not Aryan enough. A couple years later the French banned them because they had some sort of internal wine trade war and they didn't want to offend any of the important wine growers, so they just banned a couple wine varieties which were of no significance. Then after the war, Germany and France birthed a child called the European Union. There are other countries in the European Union, but basically Germany and France decide everything, and so they decided we'll keep those grapes of the Americans banned. It's a pity. You are not allowed to plant them, you are allowed to keep them in your garden in most areas. You're even allowed to harvest the grapes and make wine, but you are not allowed to sell it. It's a pity. And also, there was not much research on those grapes of the Americans. For example, I think this is Vitis labrusca. because it has a tendril at pretty much each internode. But I'm not sure because it's very hard to get really good literature on them. Despite the fact that you still cannot do without them as rootstock. They're also used for hybridization. Here, for example, right next to the Vitis labrusca, we have the Oberlin, a hybrid with the European grapevine Vitis vinifera. So this is probably all Vitis labrusca, and those tiny berries here are the Oberlin, which is also banned because it's also half an American. No matter that this hybrid was created in Alsace, it's still banned. Hanschosheim here, the village where I am, had an Oberlin festival until 10 years ago, until somebody decided to ban it. And still, despite the fact that those things have been banned for almost 90 years now, despite the fact that nobody really knows what they're everywhere. On that fence they have survived for many decades. On that wall they have survived for many decades. Here in this old vineyards they have survived for many decades. Oh, down there on this apple tree they have survived for many decades. Pretty much every single garden you find around here will have one of those American grapes. And pretty much all the old people of the village I have asked, they produce some wine from the American grapes. When you are not a professional wine grower and don't like to graft your grapes and cut them and take care of them and spray them with pesticides, just produce wine from the American grapes. The problem is, even those old people, they just know the white American, the blue American, and the red American. Or some say the white American, the pink American, and the red American. It's very hard. There are no real local names for the numerous different American varieties and their hybrids with European grapevines. It's very hard to find out what people are actually growing around here. This is most probably Vitis labrusca, but there are 4 or 5 other American grapevine varieties I've discovered around here, and I don't know what they are. I don't know if they are the original species, the original wild species of America, if they are varieties bred from those wild species, or if they are hybrids with European grapevines. I have no idea. So this video was about the history of the grapevines of the Americans, and I'll start making videos about the different varieties of those grapevines of the Americans, but unfortunately without names. If you can provide me with names for those grapes, I will be very grateful. As I said, this is most probably Vitis labrusca, but it's the most common one, together with the hybrid Oberlin. But those are the 2 only ones I can really name. So if you can tell me some names for the other ones, well, maybe you can tell me, is this Vitis labrusca here? Here are the leaves, underside of the leaves, the berries, the vines themselves. Yeah, tell me your opinion about this grapevine and about the other grapevines I'm gonna upload videos on during the next couple days. So folks, this was the history of the grapevines of the Americans, persecuted by Hitler and the European Union alike, and still alive and thriving. Stay tuned for a lot more fruit videos from the beautiful city of Heidelberg. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe.